Well, good morning. It's Richard Pearse from FinextraTV. And today I'm privileged and honoured to be joined by the Lord Mayor of the City of London, Alderman Professor Michael Mainelli. Lord Mayor is really the definition of a polymath and Renaissance man. He's a rocket scientist, an economist, a technologist, an environmentalist, accountant, and so much more. Michael, Lord Mayor, welcome to the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Richard. And it's a delight to be here with Finextra, which I've watched for many, many years.
Well, it's a pleasure. I've been along to a few of your sessions during your term in office, and I really wanted to get you onto the show today. So let's start with your vision in your time in office, Connect to Prosper. Can you tell us a bit more about what that is and really where you feel you're up to at this sort of halfway point in your term in office?
Yes, that's right. I have a 1 year term of office and I'm coming on up to the 6 month mark. So I'm doing a lot of appraisal and kind of rebalancing to focus on the end. Connect to Prosper is there to celebrate the many knowledge miles that run through the square mile. So your viewers will be familiar with the phrase the square mile, which is 1.12 square miles. So not exactly a square mile and not exactly square, but basically the old Roman walls. We constitute the world's oldest democratic workers and residents cooperative. We're nearly 1,400 years old, and we've been holding elections since the middle of the 7th century. What is interesting about the city's electorate is that it is the workers as much as the residents. So we have 615,000 people working in the square mile who have the vote and 8,000 residents. So as a politician, you can guess where my focus is on that. And what's interesting about that working population is that the marketing would tell you it's all about professional and financial services. And we most certainly are the world's leading global financial services center. However, that's only about a third of our working population. Another third is science, engineering, and technology. And a further third consists of arts, media, culture, but even areas interestingly like shipping, where we've got over 30,000 people working in the shipping industry in London, in the City of London. And that's not in shipping insurance, that's a separate sector.
Mm.
So it's a rich and varied ecosystem here. And I'm trying to celebrate the fact that we've got so many of these running through, and that when they're working together, they generate something like 10% of British GDP off of 2% of the working population. But they're solving global problems in a multidisciplinary way. And I can give you some examples in a moment. But Connect to Prosper is there to make those connections within the city, within the nation, and globally.
Fantastic. So, one of the things obviously we focus on here, and I know we'll get into it, is really sustainable finance, and obviously with the fintech linkage, and your history is so rich, and you've just explained about the connections in the city there. So you have a number of these sustainable finance initiatives within your Connect to Prosper. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Certainly. Well, Connect to Prosper has 6 big initiatives, one on mental health, one on AI and the ethics thereof, one on smart economy networks, one on constructing science in terms of converting laboratories, and one actually on another area of environmentalism, space junk. But the sixth major initiative is all around green finance. Now, Lord Mayors have traditionally been occupied with green finance since the 1950s. We passed the very first Clean Air Act in the world in 1953 here in the City of London. We were instrumental in creating the carbon markets in the mid-90s, lobbying. We've been at Rio and every single COP. And I, of course, was at COP28 in Dubai last December. So Lord Mayors tend to be passionate. I'm particularly passionate because I began doing environmental research in the 70s, helped to set up the World Conservation Monitoring Center and databases for that, have sat on several charities, Ocean Alliance, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, created the London Accord, and actually had a large hand in those carbon markets, but also in some of the newer things. For example, 2 years ago, I helped craft a bond that Chile issued, which pays a higher interest rate if Chile fails to meet its environmental targets, in particular, reducing carbon emissions and increasing the scale of renewables in their grid. So you're talking to somebody who's in the field for a while. Fintech in this space, well, it's without question that the flows of information and the redirecting of capital, as well as, to be frank, informing consumer choices and business choices in terms of what they buy, is going to be instrumental. So the fintech sector and the data sector, really, that feeds that is fundamental, I think, to any big transformation. We in the city are very keen on the carbon markets, and I sometimes think their success is underrated.
Mm.
23% of global emissions are now covered by a credible trading market since we agreed at Kyoto in December 1997 that we would use carbon markets. It's 23%, should be more, but it's doing well. And that every time we've seen a carbon market put in place, we have seen genuine emission reductions on a per capita basis and sometimes on an absolute basis. So things are going, extremely well in that area, but there's more to be done. So we have, of course, the voluntary carbon markets, and these are in their infancy, frankly, despite their age. They're very old infants. Just to give you readers a flavor, last year we had about 949 billion of issued emissions trading scheme credits. We only had about 2 billion of voluntary carbon credits. And in fact, the bonds that I spoke about last year, which are now Chile and Uruguay, and hopefully some others, Kenya, are getting on up to well over 6 billion. So we've got a problem in the voluntary carbon market area. And it has been plagued by scams. However, we need to make that market work. So a tremendous amount of work has gone into standards in that area. I, in particular, am inordinately pleased that in the last few months, the insurance sector has begun underwriting that these will actually remove tons of carbon. I believe there's 7 underwriting firms that have done such bindings, as they're called, in the Lloyd's market. So things are going well. They're just not going fast enough.
So, I mean, one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you, there's a lot of us that are relatively new to this. And as you said, you've got just an extraordinary pedigree and also very multidiscipline, where some people are very singular. When you look at the fundamental issue of climate change and nature loss, obviously things are going very badly. So when we look at the levers that you talk about as going well, and yes, needing to go faster, what would you really sort of help us understand as the blockers to make things going faster, or other levers that we should be pulling and get to really sort of pull back against the problem statement of climate and nature loss?
Oh, I sometimes think one of the difficulties is people believe there must be some other way to do it. It's everybody comes up and says, "Well, let's look at this another way." Well,
Yeah.
we've looked at it in a lot of ways, and in fact, I gave a talk here last week to Green Alliance where I was re-emphasizing a talk that I also gave to the Royal Society last month, pointing out that these are hard economic decisions. And if we're going to try and avoid the economics, we're not going to get very far. This is not about turning the kettle off or taking the tube once in a while instead of your car. These are really tough choices. We need to renovate our entire transport infrastructure, the way that we heat and cool our homes and buildings, the way we construct our homes and buildings, the way we produce primary energy, which is where most of the gains have been made so far, and what we're going to do about agriculture. Those are probably the 5 big areas. Agriculture, I'll leave to one side because even that bothers me. But in the other areas, we're looking at genuine wholesale infrastructure change. So if you're going to build an entire new, effectively, transport system, it's going to cost you. And I don't think we should be denying that. Now, not all of that is actually cost. Quite a bit of it would be maintaining the existing system. And there would be other benefits from such a system, and for example, better health, less pollutants. So I don't think it's all about the nature of the cost, but the scale of the economic change is huge. Nicholas Stern, back in 2007, concluded ultimately that it would be about 2% of GDP. That comes out at roughly 1,000 pounds of Britain. I would take you to the carbon markets. The average Briton emits 6 to 7 tons. Call it 6. Look at a price that wavers somewhere between 50 and on up to 80. So call it 50. So you're looking at 300 pounds of Britain minimum, but that only covers half the market. So again, you get on up to 600. So we're talking the better part of 1,000 pounds per Briton per year if we really want to make this change happen. And so I start there with the hard economics, and I would like to see more of the hard economics. Now, that leads you in areas like biodiversity and natural capital into a question: does economics work in that space? And I must confess, I have some doubts there. I would be more interested in reserves, set-asides, and corridors, which have been shown to work. And ultimately, we have a core problem, and you can look at this in 2 ways. One is you could argue overpopulation, which is looking as if it's going to solve itself over time, but is to some degree the root cause of many of the issues. There's just too many people for the ability of the planet to recycle. Another way to look at it is we sprawl a lot. So could we, in fact, sprawl less, or a combination of those two? So those are bigger discussions that are there. But when we do talk in this space, we frequently, in Finextra, many of your listeners will be talking about environmental, social, and governance tracking, ESG. Well, in truth, what we're really trying to do most of the time is track carbon. And I would argue we don't need to track carbon if we could make the markets work. In fact, I wrote a paper last year, Take the C out of ESG. And yes, I can spell ESG. So, so I'd like us to really focus on making those carbon markets work, because that will get that hard economics to work even better.
Understood. And just while we're on this, and we'll move on. When people talk about the UK and obviously the role of the UK in a global problem, it's very interesting to think about how we take into account all of those others. I won't list the major emitters and future emitters. Do you sort of follow people like Professor Dieter Helm in this, in that he says, we've got to build a coalition of the willing, and we have to start with ourselves? Where do you face down those people who say, well, we've done enough, let's the others catch up, which feels a bit passive to me?
Yeah, well, one can start from the outside of a moral argument. Well, it doesn't really matter. We have to do our bit, full stop. It's a global problem. I think the second thing is almost all of the measures that other people are talking about, if we sat outside it, would force us to change. So this concept of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and in fact, we're having an event I'm speaking on, I believe, on the 8th of May on this with Daniel Esty over from Yale, et cetera. You're going to find that you're on the receiving end, so you might as well be there. There was a really good report I felt done last year for the government, by the government, which pointed out to a lot of conservatives that if we lead on this, we're likely to make money on it.
Yeah.
If we sit behind, we're still going to be dragged along kicking and screaming, and we won't make the money.
Yeah.
And so I think that the key thing is, one, we have a moral argument to do it. Two, inevitably, we will have to do it because that is the way that the world is headed. And thirdly, if we get on our bikes and get moving, we actually stand to benefit more than others simply because we're doing the right thing earlier. And that's good economics. You should be doing the right thing earlier and getting benefits from that.
Fully understood. So let's move on. One of the City of London's intention is to invest in impact, exploring opportunities in this infrastructure, mobility funds, renewable energy, build a better future for the next generation. Let's talk a bit about that. So climate anxiety is a big driver of mental health issues in young people. I know you've got a focus on mental health, so perhaps let's use this as a bridge over to how do you connect with communities and young people who might look at something, such as the City of London and its whole office as being very remote from them? And how do you engage with them? How do you address some of these issues on mental health and climate anxiety? And what role have you chosen to take this year?
Well, the city has, for a very, very long time, laid down a whole bunch of structures for both young people and on mental health issues. And I could point to much that we've done on youth parks, things we've done on national numeracy, things we've done, for example, at getting the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, 10,000 of the Duke of Edinburgh Awards into the inner cities as opposed to sort of suburban secondary schools. So we're constantly active on it. The second area on mental health, we have done a tremendous amount of mental health work, including setting up a Samaritan Center for the city, staffed by the city workers, which is interesting. My particular focus this year has been a global project called Galanos. It's a project that's now reached into about 70 countries. It's being led by Oxford University with support, immense support from the Wellcome Trust. And what we're doing is we're trying to improve the speed and the quality of mental health research worldwide. I'm afraid it's a bit technical. We're doing two things. We're copying what the physics, biology, and chemistry communities did years ago, which is they created what are called preprint services. This is where academics share papers in advance, which has proven to speed up research. So for the physicists and mathematicians out there, it's the mental health equivalent of archive.org, arxiv.org. The second thing we're doing is an ontology. And the best way to think of that is a big knowledge graph Of all the 100,000 papers that were produced just last year, we've already processed 100,000 and identifying gaps. We've identified a gap, for example, in beta blockers. Where we could have probably brought out beta blockers earlier. We've identified a new treatment area for PTSD, which seemed to have been overlooked. We're getting more research put into that. And you may have also seen we've debunked mindfulness in schools. That doesn't mean mindfulness is bad. It just means the way that it's currently being applied in schools doesn't appear to show any statistically significant results. And that's what this is all about. The ontology bit is about taking and evaluating it with a view to improving quality and speeding it up. So I'm very proud of that. How do you convey that to young people, which is your question? It's frankly quite difficult. But in things like mindfulness in schools, we will be having an effect on young people. They'll have a little bit more time to spend on something else, hopefully something else that helps them with their mental anxiety.
Yeah. I suppose in a way, it's a bit like, this is slightly tangential, but open banking and open finance, people don't necessarily know what the heck that is if they're a consumer of it, but it's given all of the study and research and execution, which is actually improving people's financial life. And if people can get involved through things like Duke of Edinburgh, I think I assume people, by being engaged, are not necessarily feeling like a passive victim of something, and that is also that's part of it. But you prompted me to think about the other aspect you've got, which is your work on ethical AI. Have you found a role in defining and searching that ontology and that body of work using things like large language models? And have you thought about that in your ethical AI activity?
Yeah, not just thought about it. We've been deploying them for some time. Yeah, it's the only way you can process 100,000 papers is using automated tools. Believe me.
Yeah.
So yeah. But no, you're on something there. Yeah, on AI, one of the things I'm interested in is very much how we are going to go forward and regulate it. And I start with a slightly odd view, perhaps, but the city and finance does extremely well when trade does well. So we want open, free trade where possible, and we would like to do it. So we should be reacting to anything that looks like forming a trade barrier. And AI does bear many aspects of forming a trade barrier. We have the EU AI law, which was passed a few weeks ago, which really kind of regulates all of computing. It talks about expert systems and LLMs and machine learning, but it also goes on to logic programming and statistical techniques. So it's a very wide-ranging law. Not necessarily a bad law. This isn't an anti or pro-EU thing. But what it does say is that, it's going to do it on a risk basis. So we identified in the city that there were two things that might be deemed to be low risk. One is if a firm had actually gotten ISO 42,000 certification, then the firm might be seen to be low risk, and might they also train a number of people in ethical AI. So on both of those, we're having a charter being signed. It's called the Walbrook Accord on the 14th of May in Brussels, and over 25 countries are going to be there. ISO will be there out of Geneva, the Germans, the French, etc. And basically, people are saying, why don't we use 42,000 under the AI law to declare firms low risk? And we launched a course in which I had a strong hand in writing the syllabus last spring. We launched a course on the 10th of November, and here we are, not quite 6 months in, and we've had over 5,000 people in 45 countries, including 4 central banks and 7 regulators, take the course. So I think we've been doing a good job here in the city. Is there more to be done? Yes, I think at the moment it's really getting the message out, because we are seeing some scary stuff. I was in the States last month, and we had 3 states in 2 days pass regulations just on the regulation of AI in insurance only. And I think we're now up to about 27 states have passed a similar one, none of them being exactly the same. And that's just in insurance. So you can see the plethora of regulation that's flooding us. And actually, this is a horizontal technology more than anything, I would argue. And so this is as if they had passed laws regulating the use of fire extinguishers in banks, which is different than fire extinguishers in insurers, which was different than fire extinguishers in supermarkets, and so on.
Yeah, really interesting. It's certainly one to watch. Let's just come back as we wrap up towards to sustainable finance. I mean, one of the things that we note, when I come back to your multidisciplinary experience and great experience, is that fundamentally, you are asking, as you said in this decarbonisation of our biggest industries and finance, you're asking people to kind of really learn how to operate differently and talk differently, all the way from biology through tech, through finance and society and government. And they don't talk the same language. They don't necessarily see the problem and frame it in the same way. But you are talking about system thinking, which has got to be joined up to understand the problem before you can actually find the answer. Is it a sort of monolithic redesign that's got to be done, or is there, going back to our computing backgrounds, is there a way of sort of a microservice approach here of working in small pockets and joining things up together? How do you see this system change and your vision of change beyond your point on the carbon markets?
Well, that is truly an excellent and very deep point, and you may
I'm
regret
sorry
asking me
to
about
throw you that one.
systems theory.
I didn't warn you about that one, but I just had to ask you. It just came to my mind.
Yeah. Uh, I think I like to think I'm a pragmatist. I know many people would disagree with that assessment, um, but I think you got to work from the bottom up. In all honesty, the world's a big place, and my heart sinks every time somebody says something along the lines of "We need to have a global agreement," and I go, "Well, great. I'll leave this meeting, thank you," because if that's the requirement, it's not going to happen. But we do have a lot of fundamental binding agents. And I think we sometimes forget those. So one of them, of course, is just the nature of being a human being. There are certain things that we all react to. We all like a bit of food, we all like, et cetera. So it's odd, but there aren't many core bits. And I would argue that one of the great binding agents, and I mean this in a neutral way, it's going to sound like I worship money. It's not the worship of money may be the root of all evil. The love of money may be the root of all evil, but money itself is not evil. And money is actually a genuine binding agent. We make decisions based on money. And I've always defined money as a technology that communities use to trade debts across space and time. And that's how we as humans self-organized ourselves. And we make huge decisions. When you decide not to buy an automobile because it emits too much carbon, or you decide to avoid a holiday and do something else instead with your cash, you're making huge decisions all the time in aggregate. And so I believe there's a lot of potential for bottom-up work. And a good example in the space, getting off the theory, is it goes back to one of your earlier questions. Well, what about us? Well, if we can actually make our carbon markets work, and then they connect to other carbon markets, suddenly we get ourselves onto a global solution. And a little tiny example of that in action is even here in the city. Last month, I launched something called the City Carbon Credit Cancellation Service. And this is a facility. It's meant for individuals and for SMEs who wish to cancel real carbon on the main carbon ETS that you can't normally get access to. That's where the big boys and girls play as they trade amongst power stations. But you can now go on there, buy a real credit and have it canceled, which of course will increase the price of the remaining credits, which is the point of it. So you can actually have an effect on the real market. Yeah. And so it's little things like that I think could add up to, the bulk of a solution.
Yeah, I very much agree with you. So I'm delighted with that. You've got to go. You've got such a busy schedule, so much to achieve. What more to do in the last few months of your office? And may I ask, what do you plan to do afterwards, after having had a good rest, I'm sure?
Well, in the next 6 months, it's actually continuing those 6 programs. Each one of those programs is pretty large, and we're going to have finale events on them. I think the one thing I am looking forward to towards the end, and this is intellectually, there are many social events, as you can imagine, in the city. You kicked off with the Lord Mayor's show, and you go through to another one. But it's actually, we're having a session here with faith leaders from around the world in October, close to the end of my term, on learning how to disagree agreeably, which I think is kind of a fun one. As for afterwards, I have no idea. But one of the things people think is that when you leave office as Lord Mayor, you suddenly disappear. Actually, the Lord Mayor is just one of 25 aldermen, so you have the keys to the cars in the house for a year, and you hand them on to somebody else. But you do stick around. And all 6 of those programs, I hope to keep moving, keep those plates spinning as we move forward. So no intention of disappearing and abandoning them. I want all 6 projects to succeed.
Well, we very much want to welcome you back, perhaps get an update and also help you carry some of those things forward. I'm thinking maybe when you have your multi-faith piece, we need to get the Stoics along as well. They perhaps could teach us on how to disagree agreeably. But for now, Lord Mayor, City of London Alderman Professor Michael Mainelli, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Richard. It's been really fun.